The Calvin cycle is the second part of photosynthesis. And so remember that the light reactions have produced a bunch of NADPH and ATP. And the Calvin cycle is now going to use that ATP and NADPH from the light reactions to make sugars or carbohydrates. So this is really the part where we actually make glucose and use CO2. This happens in the stroma of the chloroplast. So it's going to need 6 CO2s. So 6 CO2s are going to be required because carbon has 6 carbons. So 6 CO2s will make a 6-carbon glucose molecule. This is a highly endergonic reaction. So the energy is coming from ATP and NADPH. But remember that those were made by the light reactions. So the light is providing the endergonic, or is providing the input of energy that this endergonic reaction requires. So the energy use is pretty high. It's going to need 18 ATP and 12 NADPH to make one glucose molecule. And so we talk about it making a glucose molecule, but it actually makes 2 molecules of something called G3P, which stands for glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. Oops. So that's G3P. Glyceraldehyde phosphate is a 3-carbon molecule, so if each one of these dots represents a carbon, I make 2 of these. And remember, glucose is 6 carbons, so it takes 2 G3Ps to make 1 glucose. So the Calvin cycle is broken into 3 basic steps: carbon fixation, reduction in carbohydrate production, and regeneration. So carbon fixation means where the CO2 is actually incorporated. So this is where the CO2 is used. So the CO2 will be added on to a molecule called ribulose bisphosphate, or RUBP for short. So CO2 is 1 carbon. I'm going to add that on to ribulose bisphosphate, which is a 5-carbon, and that is going to produce a 6-carbon molecule. That 6-carbon molecule will split into 2 3-carbon molecules. So I'm just changing to dots here. Right? And you don't need to worry about this name, okay? So we're not going to get into any more names than ribulose bisphosphate and G3P. So at the end of carbon fixation, CO2 has been incorporated, and it's now in these 3-carbon molecules. The second part of it is reduction in carbohydrate production. So this word is telling you that we have some redox reactions occurring. So this is where NADPH is going to be used. So NADPH will go back to NAD+. Remember, that's an oxidation. So that means that the carbon molecules are being reduced. So at the end of reduction and carbohydrate production, if 6 CO2s are used, I will have 12 G3Ps. Remember, that's that final product that we're going to talk about, glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. So 6 CO2s will make 12 G3Ps, but only 2 are actually considered product or will become glucose. So imagine only 2 can become glucose. The reason why is that the other 10 have to be used for this next step, regeneration of ribulose bisphosphate. So those 10 G3Ps will have to be converted into 6 ribulose bisphosphates. So imagine if I have 10 3-carbon molecules, that's equal to 30 total carbons. If I have 6 5-carbon molecules, that's also equal to 30 carbons. So I take 30 carbons in one form and convert them into 30 carbons in a different form, and that's going to cost ATP, but that gets me back to having my ribulose bisphosphate. And remember that the definition of a metabolic cycle is that I remake something that I used. So in the Calvin cycle, or not but a plant, right? So in the Calvin cycle, ribulose bisphosphate got used in the first step, and it has to be remade in the last step. So if we take a look at the Calvin cycle, And again, just focusing on the big picture, I bring in 6 CO2s and I combine those with 6 ribulose bisphosphates. That's going to give me 12 of these molecules. So the reason why it gives me 12, so let's do some more carbon accounting. I'm taking 6 ribulose bisphosphates. Remember, those each have 5, so that's 30 carbons. And I'm adding 6 carbons, so that's a total of 36 carbons of raw material. This is a 3-carbon molecule, and 3 times 12 is also equal to 36. So the 6 ribulose bisphosphates and the 6 carbons make 36 total carbons that are then rearranged into 12 of these. I then use 12 ATP and 12 NADPHs, and that gives me the 12 G3Ps. So after I spend some ATP and NADPH, I'll have 12 G3Ps. Only 2 of the G3Ps are product. And those can become glucose, or they can become other carbohydrates like starch. 10 G3Ps have to continue into the third and final stage of regeneration of ribulose bisphosphate. So again, remember that, that's a G there, sorry. Remember that this is equal to 30 carbons total, and this is equal to 30 carbons total. So this last stage is really just reorganizing carbons back into ribulose bisphosphate, because this is a cycle. If I used ribulose bisphosphate at the beginning, I have to remake it at the end. So this is putting the Calvin cycle back into the big picture. So remember, I have my light reactions. Light energy is absorbed by my photosystem. My photosystem converts that light energy into the chemical energy of ATP and NADPH. It uses water and releases oxygen gas as a byproduct. In the Calvin cycle, I incorporate CO2 here, and that CO2 is linked together to form G3P, which can go on to make glucose, starch, sucrose, and other sugars. That's going to cost energy because it's endergonic, and it's going to use the energy coming from the photosystems. The Calvin cycle then regenerates ADP and NADP+, which gets sent back to the light reactions for reuse. The Calvin cycle takes place in the stroma. The photosystems and light reactions are in the thylakoid membrane. So in order to make 1 glucose, I need 6 CO2s, 18 ATPs, and 12 NADPHs. So if you think about cellular respiration, 1 glucose will be able to produce 34 to 38 ATP. So the cell will be able to get this much ATP. It had to use this much ATP and NADPH. So this makes sense because remember, this part of it is endergonic, the endergonic production of glucose, and this part is the exergonic breakdown of glucose. So the energy can either go in or it goes out, but it's the same amount of energy. Why would a poison that inhibits an enzyme in the Calvin cycle also inhibit the light reactions? Well, remember that the Calvin cycle sends ADP and NADP+ back to the light reactions. So if you stop your Calvin cycle, then the light reactions run out of NADP+ and ADP, and again, that's in the light reactions. So certain poisons actually are Calvin cycle inhibitors. The one that most people have heard of is Roundup. Roundup works by inhibiting the Calvin cycle. If you inhibit the Calvin cycle, the plant can't carry out photosynthesis and will die. And so Roundup kills pretty much every plant.